Welcome everyone to Mr. Ashby's APUSH review. Today we're going to be looking at period 1. This period we see Native Americans and early colonization, and it's going to be prior to 1600s. So the focus of this is going to be basically early Native American cultures, the first European colonization, and we're going to be looking a little bit on the three big ones: the Spanish, the French, the Dutch colonization periods in this time period. Period 2 will more focus on the English colonization side of this. On this review, it's about 5% of the AP exam, and there will be no DBQs and no LEQs on this time period. You may get a SAQ, which there has been 2 SAQs so far on this period, and you will get or could get a couple multiple choice questions. And that's sort of what it goes. So let's get right started into the review. Okay, so the very first part, you do need to know some background on Native Americans. The main Native Americans in this time period, there's going to be a very diverse, they aren't going to really focus on the Spanish Native Americans, the ones in Mexico and the ones in South America, Central America. The AP is really going to focus on the North American tribes. So that's where we're going to go with this. And we really want to make sure that we know the diversity of these Native Americans. We want to know that it was a very diverse group with huge amounts of culture, with huge amounts of tribes, and that the European colonizers were not going to be coming over to America into an empty land. It was going to be a very sort of rich land with lots of tribes and lots of culture and lots of people that they're going to be intermixing with. Okay. So in this northern settlement, again, in the areas of North America prior to Spanish colonization, we need to know that there was a very complex and varied civilization, that depending on the region that these Native Americans were living in, they was going to have a very diverse and very different way of life. The North American land was very bountiful, huge amounts of resources, huge amounts of animals, and there's going to be no shortage of ability to get food. Again, depending on where you were, the food was going to be very different, or how you were going to attain that food. But again, there was a large amount of resources available to natives. Most of these clans and most of these tribes were very small, as in they weren't living in large population clusters, and most of them formed small little clans that sort of kept to themselves. There were some exceptions with that. Again, there were some larger tribes up in the Mississippi Valley area. We'll get to that in a little bit. And there's also some tribes that sort of form these nations or these governing bodies. The most recognizable one is going to be this Iroquois nation here. And that's really the only one that you would need to know for the AP test. Again, there was other ones, but this was the largest one that will come in contact with the English settlement in the 1600s. And again, most tribes will develop agriculture as their main food source. So they will be sort of like in one location. On the Great Plains, as we'll talk about a little bit later, there will be nomadic tribes. But for the most part, Native Americans will stay in one regional area and develop, villages and agricultural fields and a society based on that settlement. Okay, this gives us a nice sort of layout of America and where the different geographical areas were in regards to North American tribes. Again, so the big ones that the AP are going to focus on are 3 big areas. They're going to focus on the Southwest area and the tribes there, especially in New Mexico, because that's where the Spanish settlement's going to be early on. And they're also going to settle and then really focus on the woodland tribes, especially up in this area, right in the coastal areas right here, because they're going to have the most contact with the English up here and down there, and then the French in this area right here and up in the Mississippi Valley area. Later on in this course, we are going to be looking at the Plains Native Americans, especially in the 1800s. And then again, there is other Native Americans in the Great Basin, the Plateau, and the West. But again, for the most part, these areas will not be covered on the AP test. But again, it is great background knowledge, great context, great analysis if you can use some of these very diverse tribes within your writing. Okay, one of the focuses is the eastern woodland tribes, especially the Iroquois and the Algonquin. So those are the ones that usually come up on the AP test, are those two larger tribes there. Also get the Pequot tribes, the Delaware, the Mohawk tribes will also come up. And these tribes were typically sedentary, which means that they stayed in the same place within the same villages with very little nomadic movement. They were typically hunting and gathering and cultivation. Again, they would sort of offset both of them. So there were hunters and there were also gatherers and agriculturalists too. And there's going to be a huge abundance of resources and wildlife and growing ability. Obviously, in this area up here, there is going to be some limits on growing ability because of the soil and also the climate is going to be a little more harsher. But for the most part, again, they're going to be able to farm a great deal of crops. Okay, the other group that does come up on the AP test quite a bit for this early Native American time period is the Southwest tribes. Mostly because, again, the Spanish are going to be settling this area right in here, so we're going to have that in period 1. And again, they're the Nzani, the Navajo, the Apache, the Zuni, the Hopi, and the Hokkakam. These were also areas that are called the Pueblos. That's important, the sort of word to know, because many of these tribes in this area right here will form these small villages called pueblos. And so they're called the Pueblo Native Americans or the Pueblo Indians. And all these would classify as that. Also, they had cliff dwellings. One of the most famous one was this cliff dwelling in Mesa Verde right here. And they're still around, again, the dwellings around in a historical form in their area. And also, these were slightly different. There was agriculture in this area, but there was less diverse agriculture because it was so arid. And so, again, geographically speaking, they were more limited in what they could grow and what was available to them in regards to agriculture. Okay, so those are the two big ones you should know in regards to this. So now let's get into the European colonization of the Americas. There's going to be three big waves of it. Again, obviously, the most important one for this time period is going to be the Spanish. Then with other ones being the French, the Dutch, the English coming afterwards in variedness of importance. In regards to the Spanish colonization, obviously Christopher Columbus was this Spaniard, not Spaniard, but he sailing under the Spanish flag. Again, he was Italian, who really sort of opened this world to the Europeans. I hate the word using finding the world because, again, of course, he didn't find this area. It was already found by thousands of years and hundreds of thousands of Native Americans. But he did open it up to European population and extraction. And that's a big word, extraction. And you see there, those are the trips he did. The big famous one was the 1492 one, where he discovered this area for the first time for European eyes, Hispaniola. And then again, he'll come back in other regions too. And there were other sailors and other explorers that explored the whole area of North America, the West Coast, South America. But those aren't something that we're going to be focusing on in this class. Next came the conquistadors. These were the people that, now that this area was found for Europeans, these are the people that were going to now rule this area and subjugate the natives and the land itself. You have Pizarro and the Incas down in Peru and South America. You have De Soto, who founded Florida for Europeans. You have Coronado, who will trek all through New Mexico and the southwestern part of the United States. And of course, probably the most famous one is Cortez, who will subjugate the Aztecs in Mexico. None of these people really do come up on the AP test directly, but they will lead to other terms and vocabulary that will come up, like the Ecumenides system, which we'll talk about in a few slides from now. Okay, settlements. This is an important thing to know about the overall sort of goals and ideology of the Spanish. Spanish typically did not focus on long-term sustainable settlement, but resource extraction, meaning they weren't wanting to have a new Spain with huge population clusters in that area. They were wanting a new Spain to basically get resources, especially gold and silver and metals, to get back to the home country. So they're going to set this area up very differently than, for example, the English, who are wanting this more developed culture and settlement area. Mostly men came over there. Again, they were really looking for one thing, for resource extraction. And while doing this, they will set up very, very strict laws and taxes and religious rules for their areas. And this will be really important because one thing they're really pushing is missionary services and really trying to convert the natives into Catholicism while at the same time subduing them and forcing them into a forced labor system, which we'll get to in a slide or two from now. And so, for the most part, the Spanish had really harsh treatment of the natives to subjugate them and really enforce their rules onto them. Okay, here's some big overall trends for this time period. Again, obviously the Spaniards had very superior weapons and technology. They did not have larger numbers. Obviously the natives had larger numbers, but the technology for the Spanish was very great. The Spanish were known for their harsh and widespread treatment of natives, again, subduing them into forced labor. Not direct slavery, but pretty much, forced labor, a form of slavery. We'll get to that. A big part of this also was the death rate of the natives. We're going to get to that in a slide or two, but the death rate was huge for the natives, and that's going to be a really big thing. Also, there was going to be a large push on conversion. Up and down the California coast, they're going to set up missionaries, and there'll also be other missionaries that'll be coming over in the Southwest and the Caribbean islands to convert natives to Catholicism. And natives weren't usually able to band together during this time period. And so very few Native American uprisings did take place. Another thing to note is that the Spaniards, because there was such a small amount of women who had come over, they did interrelate and intermarry with Native Americans in many cases, which many of the other groups of settlers, the French, the Dutch, and the English did not do in as large numbers. And so that's going to be a difference between the Spanish and those other groups, especially the English, in regards to their interaction with the natives. Okay, and these are two men that you should know for the AP test. The AP likes to really play these two men off each other. So these are great ways to use comparison and contradiction within your writing or within AP test questions. So two different views on this same time period of the Spaniard colonization. First is Bartolomé de las Casas. He was a missionary conquistador that came over and then eventually turned his viewpoint around regarding the Native Americans. He wrote a short account of the destruction of the Indies, which really described the atrocities against the indigenous people of the West Indies, and really sort of made a point or an argument that the Spanish had changed their way of thinking and their actions towards the natives. Another Spaniard who has an opposite view of Las Casas was Juan de la Sepulveda. And he was a Spaniard who basically was trying to defend the Spanish emperor's right of conquest and how they treated the natives within that conquest. Pretty much he put down the natives, calling them savages, and trying to back it up that they treated themselves in that same way, almost more cruel than the Spaniards treated them. So it's a great way to play two different viewpoints of the same time period off each other. Okay, 3 permanent Spanish settlements that are still around today that we can look at as historical examples. The first permanent Spanish settlement in North America would be St. Augustine, which was a military base right about here. It was not a large settlement. It was pretty much just a military fort used to then help patrol the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico and basically the West Atlantic Ocean to really ward off pirates, ward off state-sponsored piracy of the English and the French and the Dutch. Well, I don't have a picture of that, but the Catholic missions are going to be up and down the California coast. And Santa Fe is going to be the oldest capital city, basically being set up in 1609 in the northern New Mexico. Okay, let's get to New Mexico. It was colonized as a agricultural base And it's not going to be the first area that uses this system, but it will be really, utilizing this. And this is where the AP will come into with this terminology, the encomienda system. It is basically a forced labor system. What it did that these Spaniards will distribute licenses to other Spanish royalty, and it will allow the Spanish royalty to basically extract labor from the Spaniards, or these, in this case, the Pueblo Native Americans. So this is going to be a forced labor system. So these Pueblos are allowed to go back to their dwellings in the evening, but they're required to work within the fields and within the cultivation for these Spaniards in the daytime. Many of these Native Americans will be killed in this if they don't do what they're asked to do. So again, it is very harsh treatment. It's not direct slavery like you would have ownership of slaves with like we typically know about African American slaves, but it is a form of that. And so the forced labor system is going to really come back, and in some cases, some Native Americans will rise up to fight against this too. We'll get to that in this slide right here. The one example of revolt in this time period that was somewhat successful was the Pueblo Revolt. It is also called the Popey's Rebellion because the leader was the Native American chief Popey, which actually banded together several different Pueblo tribes. And what they did, they were able to oust the Spanish government and the church from New Mexico for a 12-year period. But eventually the Spanish will come back, and by 1696, they will basically crush the revolt. Once this happens, the Pueblos go back into the forced labor system, and this is one of the really only times that there is a sort of a successful revolt rebellion against Europeans by the natives. There's other times they attempted, like for example, Metacom's War in the 1600s in New England was another time that Native Americans tried to make this happen. Okay, this is a big one. The AP will play off this a lot, either in SAQ questions or multiple choice questions. The Columbia Exchange. This is this big concept of basically the exchange of agriculture, ideas, technology, disease from Europe to the New World, basically from one culture to another. And some of this is going to have some positive effects, mostly negative effects when it comes to Native Americans though. And it goes both ways. There is exchange on both sides of it. Obviously, we see this picture here. This was taken from one of the practice AP tests. And this is a picture of showing the disease being spread into the New World, obviously being smallpox here, killing huge amounts of natives. Over half of the native population will perish through disease. And in some cases, up to 90%, 95% of some of these smaller islands. And we see here basically what Native Americans got. They got coffee, rice, sugar, wheat. They got other fruits, they got cattle, chicken, diseases. Really, probably the only real good thing that the natives benefited from the Columbia Exchange were horses. And you could even argue that this actually hurt Native American tribes overall. But again, this is probably the one positive thing. Obviously, the biggest things were these diseases. This is what really affected them the most on a negative way. From North America, you see mostly what they got were new types of crops, new types of food. And this will be important because all these new types of crops, especially potatoes and other grains, beans and corn, are going to really help fuel a population increase in Europe. So a lot of these grains will allow European cities and European areas to exponentially grow when it comes to population-wise. So that's going to be a positive thing for the European continent. Another thing that was brought over that is not shown here, of course, is going to be slavery. And that's going to be a ethnic cultural exchange we'll see here too. So again, what this doesn't show religion, this doesn't show culture, it just shows, of course, the physical aspects of exchange. Again, it'd be great to also add in the cultural exchange that happens to religion and ideologies and stuff like that, intermarriage. So slavery is obviously going to be a big one. The Spanish are going to start bringing African slaves from West Africa over to the Caribbean islands. The real reason for this is that the Native American population, since they were so subject to dying from diseases, were not a good labor source to put into slavery. And what this was, this really started the slave trade and allowed for this huge new culture of African Americans to be mixing with Spanish, with Native Americans, and eventually English and French and the Dutch also. And we'll get much more into slavery and its effect on North America in the upcoming reviews and units. Okay, now we're going to be looking at non-Spanish colonization. Okay, the English, the French, and the Dutch. Okay, so the biggest thing is this reason for colonization. There's lots of factors into this. The biggest thing you really need to know about is mercantilism. We'll get to that in just a second. Obviously, there was an increasing number of people in Europe. There was more poverty, more food shortages in Europe. There was also a lot of religious stuff going on in Europe, like the Reformation and other inequalities and intolerations that was also going on. But this is a term that does come up quite a bit on the AP test. You really want to know this very well. Mercantilism is economic policy or principle that is backed and based on state-controlled economic system. Basically, you have a colonizing country who's going to basically seek out other areas or other land masses to colonize. The whole purpose of that was to get raw materials that could be sent back to the home country. Basically, they would want those raw materials, they make them to finished goods, then they then send those or sell those goods back to the colonizing country for huge profits. So it's going to be a forced trade to finished goods to the colony. And the way they would do that to make sure that these goods would only flow in one direction is that the English will eventually create these navigation acts, these laws that would forbid English colonies from trading with any other country or trying to create those same goods in the American colonies themselves. And here's a couple of schematics of it. So you obviously have the colonizing country right there, and you have the colony. So there's England right here, here's the America, pretty much is what it would be. So what England's wanting is that America is going to be sending its raw materials, raw tobacco, raw rice, wool from sheep, lumber, eventually, all sorts of these different goods, fish and pine tar and pitch and all sorts of things. And what England's going to do with it is going to manufacture it in their new industrial revolution and make finished goods. And they'll send these finished goods back to the American colonies for huge profits. So obviously what it does, it allows the mother country, which is England's treasury, to go up. Gold and silver, it's going to be coming back. And for the most part, it's going to be a very balanced trade where it's going to favor the home country over the colonies. The other big reason for the colonization was going to be religious colonization. We're going to see a lot of intolerance in England and other European countries. For example, France is going to be a big intolerance for some groups. And let's talk about English here. So the Church of England was founded, and most Puritans were not wanting to separate from the Church of England, just reform it. So we're going to see a lot of Europeans and a lot of English coming over for more toleration, sort of just to get out from this very strict Church of England. Two colonies that were set up in that way, which we'll get to in period 2, is going to be the Plymouth colony, who were separatists, who actually wanted to separate from the Church of England, and the Massachusetts Bay colony, who were basically reformist or non-separatist, who just wanted to reform this Church of England, but not actually separate from it. And we'll see these two colonies again in period 2. During period 1, the one English colony that was set up is called Roanoke, or the Lost Colony. Typically, that does not get put onto the AP test. But again, this is what was the one attempt by England to colonize North America in this early time period. Sir Walter Raleigh will be the colonist, and along with several others. There'll be 91 men, 17 women, and 9 children. And what's going to happen is that they're going to basically pick a very secure area in North Carolina. It's going to be behind the Barrier Islands. It's going to be an island. It's going to be very protected. The problem, though, it is not going to be great for growing crops. And so therefore, it's going to have a very limited amount of success because there's not very much crops you can grow on this island. So what Sir Walter Raleigh does is he basically goes back to England, promises to return within 1 year with more supplies, more men, more women, more ships. And what happens is there's a war between Spain and England. And during this war, basically the English government calls all merchant ships and all vessels to be basically taken by the British Navy and then used in this war. And of course, they won't be able to come back. And so it's going to take 3 years to be able to come back. By that time, when they get back to the settlement, everyone's gone. It's deserted. Nothing's there. And it's sort of a mystery what exactly happens there. Was it an Indian raid? Was it a starvation thing? Did they just leave because they couldn't grow? What was the issue? And eventually they're going to obviously set up Jamestown in 1607, but that will start off period 2. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, the last two settlements. One's going to be the French settlements. The French settlement, which you'll see, is going to be mostly in this present-day Canada area. Also, there's going to be a little bit down into North America. It's called the Ohio River Valley. And there will also be some settlements right along the Mississippi River and right down here at New Orleans are the areas it's going to be. But pretty much early on, it's mostly in this area right here. And that was going to be founded by Samuel de Champlain, which can found Quebec in 1607. Quebec, again, is that capital city right there. And they're going to call it New France. It's going to be a very small population. It's going to be mostly fur trappers and missionaries who are going to be there. And again, they're going to have a pretty good relation with the natives. They don't really want to subjugate them. They aren't going to enslave them. They do convert them. They are going to have missionaries who are going to try to really convert them to Catholicism. But it's going to be more of an easy conversion or easy relationship between the two comparatively. The French will also have a colony in Haiti where they're going to be, basically going for Caribbean sugar colonies. Obviously, a very different treatment of natives there, and slaves are going to be used in Haiti. So again, but usually that's not going to be really come up. This will come up in regards to the Louisiana Purchase later on in period 4. And for the most part, the French are going to be very non-invasive. They aren't going to create big population clusters. They're going to be pretty good with their treatment with the natives. There is going to be some intermarriage with the natives also in this regard. And the last group of settlement will be the Dutch. The Dutch are going to basically, again, this is a little bit outside the time period, but I like to talk about it right now just so you see the different types of colonial areas. It's going to be found by Henry Hudson. He's going to find the New York colony right there and going to go up the Hudson River, again named after Henry Hudson there. They're also going to have a small area of Dutch colonization right there, and basically where Philadelphia is, which is like right about there, Philadelphia. And what they're going to do, they're going to set up a couple things. They're going to basically set up trading posts, New York being the biggest one, and fur trapping areas. For the most part, their treatment of the natives is going to be almost non-existent. They aren't going to really subjugate them. They obviously will buy land or sort of steal land from Native Americans to set up some of their colonies and their posts. And they're going to actually encourage a large amount of European diversity to come into the area. So early on, New Amsterdam, which is now currently New York, is going to have a huge amount of diversity comparatively to other colonies. And it's going to be quite small. Eventually in 1660, with threat of war, the Dutch will sell this land to England, and this will be renamed New York. And here's a map of all the different colonial areas. Obviously here, eventually, you're going to see the British setting up colonies up and down this area right here. You're going to see the French really developing colonies within the center part of the United States and Canada. The Spanish will have all the Southwest up in California eventually, and Florida. And there's going to be the area up here, which is really going to be no man's land. Russia is going to have some small colonies up and down the coast, with the most southern one, Fort Ross, which is going to be about right there above San Francisco. Okay, the last little section are past SAQs. So these are the two SAQs that have been on AP test in the past. The first one is confine your response to the periods from 1500 to 1750. So again, this goes past period 1 a little bit, but it's still one that could fall into period 1. So briefly describe one specific historical difference between the role of the religion in Spanish colonization and the colonization of New England. Well, obviously, you could talk about that in regard to Catholicism and the conversion of Native Americans in the time period to Catholicism, where the New England didn't really try to convert natives to Puritanism at all. There was praying towns, but for the most part, the English really let the natives practice religion they wanted, if they wanted. B, briefly describe one specific historical similarity between the role of religion in Spanish and the colonization of New England. Okay, so you can do that one. And then briefly explain one specific historical effect of religion on the development of society in either English or Spanish colonies. So that was one from a few years ago. And this was the very first one. I think this one came out in 2016. Again, very similar. Briefly explain one important similarity between the goals of the Spanish and English in establishing colonies in America prior to 1700. Briefly explain one important difference between the goals of the Spanish and English in establishing colonies in America prior to 1700. And briefly explain one way in which the differences you indicated in B contributed to a difference in development of Spanish and English colonies and societies. Okay, so that was period 1. Hopefully that does a lot of good, a lot of help. And until next review session, good luck with your studying, good luck with your processing, and we'll see you guys next time. Have a great day.